To this session of DML 2017. We have special guests on site, and my colleague Alan Levine will introduce them, and then I guess we can introduce ourselves afterwards, all the other people who are piping in virtually. And I'm Mia Zamora. Currently I'm in Norway on my sabbatical as a faculty member in the Department of Digital Culture at the University of Bergen.
Excellent. Thanks, man.
Alan? Yeah.
My turn, right? I'm just marching in.
Yes, yes.
It's a thrill to have Henry Jenkins here. And we have like this kind of sprawling participation because I got my class going on and we got some students here. And we have Henry's co-speaker tomorrow, Esra'a Al-Shafei, who is going to be, you can hear her, but you won't see her. But and so we don't have a real structure for this. This is kind of like, we say it's like extending like what the hallway conversations at conferences are to people who can't be here. And that's what we decided to do here. And so we don't have an agenda or specific thing, although one of my students wants to ask you a question.
Okay.
And I have one of mine has something to ask as well. I think it's pretty timely, the question.
That's great. Well, we're happy to hear.
Perhaps Helen, do you mind introducing yourself?
Sure. I'm Helen DeWard at Faculty of Education here in Ontario, Central Ontario, and I am actually in my classroom with my students. They are watching this live broadcast, and it's my first experience doing this type of thing with my students, so I'm very happy to be here.
You're an adventurer.
Victor, you have to unmute.
Yeah, now I see. Hi guys, I'm Victor. I'm a Belgian student currently in Norway for half a semester, and I'm one of Professor Zamora's students. Happy to be here.
Great. Meryl?
Hi, I'm Meryl Rasmussen. I'm in Rio de Janeiro, and I'm a friend of Helen's through UBC.
Cool. Aspa and Anders? You have to unmute. Yeah.
Yeah.
Hi, we are digital culture students, master students, and it's my second experience on this virtual thing.
Hello.
Excellent, guys. Welcome. My beloved Kane students.
Sorry about that. We're Kane Writing Studies Master students. My name is Haley.
I'm Rashonda. I'm Laura. I'm Catherine.
And I'm Marissa.
I miss you guys.
Miss you too.
And Jeffrey.
Hi, I'm Jeffrey Duvall, and I run the Young Writers Project from Northern Vermont.
Excellent.
We kind of didn't give a chance for Henry. Well,
yeah.
People know who you are.
Last but certainly not least, Henry and Esra'a.
I'm going to hear about the format and discussion for tomorrow.
So are we. This is improv. Well, Esra'a, why don't you say a little bit about yourself, and I'll jump in.
Sure. Can you guys hear me?
Can you hear Esra'a okay? Mia just went silent. Just on the technology, let me turn my microphone.
That was my fault. I muted myself. I just wanted to say that we could hear you and the two of you clearly, but Esra'a's voice is fainter because she's farther away. So if she could project her voice, then we'll hear her.
Right here, and I just turned up my microphone volume because I forgot it was low.
Excellent.
Can you guys hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, great. So my name is Esra'a. I'm from Bahrain, a small island in the Middle East. And I do human rights advocacy since the last 12 years. So we create online platforms at my organization that amplify marginalized communities, the voices of ethnic and religious minorities who have been persecuted in the region, LGBTQ individuals. We just do a lot of work around figuring how can we raise our voices in a world where surveillance and censorship is now the norm, while protecting our identities. So that's really what I'm all about. I'm excited to discuss these things with you guys.
Cool.
And I'm Henry Jenkins. I teach at the University of Southern California. And we're currently working on what's called the Civic Imagination Project, which has been funded by the MacArthur Foundation to try to inspire people to think about alternative futures and the ways we might bring about social change. And in particular, we're very interested in the intersection of participatory politics and popular culture. Stories from the culture around us to inspire us to think differently about the world.
It's probably starting to feel like there's boundaries of what's culture and politics is.
Well, yeah, culture and politics are the same thing at this point. I mean, I think what we're seeing is cultural producers are taking on greater political responsibility and are more and more figures of dissent and resistance in the US. And I think we're seeing people are more and more taking those images and pulling them into protest. So we might at one point have talked about culture jamming as blocking the signal. But now I think we're talking about cultural acupuncture, to use a phrase of the Harry Potter Alliance, which is trying to shift, to identify pressure points within the culture in order to shift circulation. I really love that metaphor for thinking about what's going on. But we are seeing, no sooner does a television series about Handmaid's Tale, for example, appear on television than we see handmaids appearing at protest marches. That Carrie Fisher dies and we see Princess Leia reemerge, you know, as the figure of the feminist movement during the Women's March. We're seeing the three-finger salute get used as a symbol around the world for struggles over wealth inequality. So what my team does is goes into communities, particularly communities where there have been disputes or where there are tensions, and tries to get people to imagine a future together, to go to brainstorm and world build the future of 2050, 2060. What does that look like? And we've done it in everywhere from Beirut with leaders from 10 educational leaders from 10 Arab countries to Bowling Green, Kentucky a couple of weeks ago, where we were talking to former coal miners and tobacco farmers and trying to help them think about the future work in Kentucky. In a few weeks, we're going to Arkansas to work with faith-based leaders that are fighting there for refugee settlement and against Islamophobia. So we're trying to go where these tension points are in the culture to help people think about alternatives. And one of the things we're hearing is that if you go far enough off, there's a great deal of consensus about what an ideal future is. It's the partisan process of getting there that gets in our way of finding some unified vision of the changes that are taking place in our society.
What are some approaches you use when you go into those communities for the world building?
I mean, we start by having people bring in a meaningful object. And that allows us to get from them to share something of their own story and their own relationship to the topic. That's a very powerful moment, a very emotional moment. It really focuses people on their identity. Then we have the world building moment where we just say, let's imagine the world of 2050, 2060. What does transportation look like? And we'll start with the technological because everyone's used to thinking of science fiction. We go to healthcare, we go to education, we go to food, we go to family, go to religion. We go through all of the sorts of topics and see what emerges there. Because for us, the civic imagination is this idea, before you can change the world, you've got to imagine what a better world looks like. You've got to imagine a process of social change. You imagine yourself as an agent of change. You have to imagine the community that have shared interests that can work toward change together. You often have to have empathy for a group whose experiences or perspectives are different from your own. And if you're an oppressed people, you have to imagine freedom and equality before you've directly experienced it. So we're trying to take people through that process. So we imagine the world, then they have to think about what process would get there. And they write a story with characters and conflicts to define a turning point between the current moment and the future moment that shows how change took place. And then we, at the very last minute, ask them to perform that. They get 10 minutes to get ready to do a skit. In the US, they're usually broadly comic. It was interesting in Beirut, they were deeply melodramatic. I mean, the style of performance that people were most comfortable with there. Much of it was in Arabic, so I didn't understand what was being said, but I could see the emotion of the gestures and vocal expressions there. And then coming out, we have a debrief where we think about what the mechanisms of change are, and that leads into moments where the group itself connects, networks, figures out the next steps, and begins to figure out how to work for a problem, forward on a problem that might grow out of having a shared civic imagination. Whereas analytically, our team's looking at case studies of movements all over the world where the civic imagination has come into play. And often those are moments of conflicting civic imagination. So my piece for that book deals with the Broadway musical Hamilton, which was trying to identify, link the myth of America's founding with a more diverse America. And comparing it to the Tea Party, which uses the national founding for a very different set of ideological purposes and uses the moment where Pence is confronted from the stage by an actor to sort of bring that into focus for us. But it's about two different ways of mobilizing history through pop culture to think about the current moment of political change in the United States. But we'll have 30 essays from cultures all over the world in the book.
I was thinking, I mean, you probably answered. I was going to ask Esra'a about how the World Good Exercise would translate to people in Bahrain as sort of an exercise activity. Is something you've done so far, or?
I've never personally experienced it before. Bahrain and the Gulf in general is never really a place where people go to conduct these kinds of studies because of how repressive it really is. Yeah. Oman, Jordan, these places are much easier usually for people to come in and conduct these kinds of studies. So we're not really used to that kind of interactive learning quite yet. And especially when it comes to how do we identify with other, even with our peers, we're just not used to communicating about these kinds of themes and ideas with each other, because growing up, it's always been, you can't talk about politics, you can't talk about the environment, you can't talk about migrant workers. There are just so many off limits, and that's really why so many young people have turned to music. Independent music in the Arab and Muslim world is has one of the largest independent scenes in the globe, next to Latin America, and that is for a reason. It's because that we are so eager to express ourselves, to discover our cultures, and the barriers and the boundaries that we were never able to discover as young children, either because we never had the visas, because these countries were engaged in war first, so we were never able to go, even though they were our neighbors. We've never been to a lot of the times places like Iran. Many Bahrainis have never been to Saudi Arabia for various reasons, because they're members of a sect that is persecuted in Saudi Arabia. But now we start communicating with each other through pop culture, through music, through comedy, through videos, skits. So, the digital world has really completely transformed how we communicate with each other, how we learn about ourselves, and how we just discover the world around us in a completely transformative way.
Reminds me of Dana's description, like if you set up these restrictions, people naturally figure the ways around it.
Yeah, that's right. And it's usually very creative, Yeah. I mean, the reason people turn to music is not because everybody is an expert musician all of a sudden, but because it was a lot more difficult to censor. Audio is difficult to censor. That's why podcasting is huge in the Arab world, much more so than blogging and just content and things like that. So it's really just been learning how to bypass censorship in creative ways, while at the same time reaching different audiences in a way that we've never been able to do before.
All right, I was thinking, as Henry was describing some world building, maybe Catherine, do you want to talk about your project and see what Dr. Jenkins thinks of it?
I got really excited when I heard you talking about the Civic Imagination Project. Yeah, we have like a weird echo. My thesis, I'm going to be examining a certain type of community on DeviantArt, which in itself is an online community. But I've noticed these closed species communities in which a creator will create this species and a world, and people will either buy or obtain rights to create or have a character in this world, in this species, and they'll work together to try to make like this kind of transmedia storytelling thing. But what's interesting about it, is it's completely independent. These are either amateur or emerging artists or art students that are creating it. And there are specific things happening. Oh, I forgot to say, I'm looking at this through the lens of participatory culture and civic imagination. But there's certain things happening in these communities in terms of like economic aspects and like conflict resolution, which I feel kind of reflect that civic imagination of like, what would a better world look like? What would a more responsible and humane way of buying and selling, you know, consuming and producing, what would that look like? And I feel like they're enacting that. I've been using this term that I made up called purified consumerism to talk about the ways that people go about, you know, buying, selling, trading designs and rights in these communities, and also the ways that conflicts are dealt with. They just seem very much more civilized than I've seen in a lot of other communities. So I'm just taking a look at all that.
Sounds like a fascinating project. I heard a little bit about this space. We had one of the leaders of DeviantArt speak to my fandom seminar in the spring. He shared some stories of that space with us. I've always sort of said that there are very few examples of transmedia that have generated bottom up, that fans in general create built on existing mass media franchise platforms. And we can take the Marvel extended universe and take it in radically new directions. But it's very hard to spontaneously generate a cultural form. And this comes as close as I've seen doing that. And that's part of what makes it an interesting topic to me. Now the challenge, I think, thinking about it as a side of civic imagination, or something I would encourage you to think through, goes back to Stephen Dunkam's work, which is really inspires ours. And he has it on a website called Open Utopia, where he's really looking at what utopian writing has done historically. And part of his argument is utopias are not blueprints, they're provocations. And I find that a really useful notion. It's not about mapping what an actual future we want to live in, it's about posing a rhetorical alternative powerful enough that it gets us to question the world we actually live within now. It's about...
I'm sorry.
Yes.
What was the name?
Stephen Duncan, O-U-N-C-O-M-B, Open Utopia. So the idea that, you know, we need a utopia that envisions what we might like to achieve. It's a yard post against which we can measure our current reality and map the steps to get there. And so I would be looking, is this about creating an alternative world that everyone just wants to live within and stay there? Or is there a movement out from it into the real world, or a critical engagement with the real world that would lead to some kind of social change? So I can imagine a civic imagination that becomes almost pure escapism and would be a rational response to the world we're living in this right now, and particularly the world Dana described this morning. You just want to duck your head and crawl into a hole. But the alternative is there a way that you can move from that, the social change stuff? I say the Harry Potter Alliance has moved people from thinking about Hogwarts into thinking about change in our world and thinking about human rights and fair trade, chocolate, and any number of topics that organization has directed attention to. I don't know, do you have any, does this world have any resonance for you at all?
Yeah, we try not to be as pessimistic as Dana.
Yes.
So every time Dana try to say, oh, but it's better, right? And then she gets another chemo the next year, and it actually got worse.
Yes, it is hard.
Yeah, but yeah, where we are, and these are never had before, so it's a little bit more for us. It certainly did get better for us in many different ways, just in terms of access. I mean, because of the censorship that the result from that, for example, is that tens and thousands more people per year per hour content, because they're now curious, what is being censored? What is creating more create content. So yeah.
Alan, I think we're going to have a little bit of a translation, because we couldn't hear what Esra'a was saying. It was very hard to hear.
Want to summarize?
Yeah, sorry.
That's okay. Let's see. I was listening. So I think she said that there's a lot of, well, it's not a utopian culture, so they're already starting with a bit more, I hate to say reality, but what we're experiencing with our shock, but also the fact that what's been happening with the internet is more and more people in the Arab world are curious about what's going on in this space that seems to be outside the periphery of control.
Mm-hmm.
And so that some of the things to be optimistic about is that more people want to try to experience and get connected. And so like this idea that we can just keep people controlled by limiting their communication. Yeah, it's not going to work. They're always finding the end around. And so maybe that's a thing to be somewhat optimistic about.
So, regarding that whole idea of like your networks and who you're listening to, and like the question of a diversity of networks, I know that my students and I were speaking about this issue earlier, and I think Victor wanted to ask something in that regard as well. I don't know, hopefully the connect makes sense, but we had a question that we wanted to ask as well.
Yeah, it's about like the filter bubble and like the echo chamber effect that like really happens on social media. So this is a question to Henry Jenkins. How does having knowledge about the echo chamber affect people's online practices in like terms of diversification?
That's a good question. I've been struggling with how to address it in my own life, let alone in a larger social sphere. I mean, I think the goal is always for us as educators to create transparency, to help people know what's going on. But that sense of the filter bubble, knowing is not sufficient because we still are constrained in what information we have access to, and it becomes really difficult to move beyond it. I think the most important lesson from the filter bubble research is to know that it exists, that it is shaping what we're seeing, that we're only seeing a partial segment of the information, that we're not seeing the whole world, that we don't know whether the part we're seeing is representative of the larger world that surrounds us, and we have to actively seek out other sources beyond what's most readily and easily presented to us. Because it's come so easy, like everyone else, I have a news app on my phone, I hit it every morning, multiple times a day, and I read the stories that come through it. And unless you force yourself beyond that, you're limited in what you see. And as an American, we're hearing nothing about Esra's culture right in the country. The news doesn't give us any information about anything that's taking place in that part of the world. We were blacked out. So it's not censored, it's just ignored. But that sense of the filter bubble not allowing us access to parts of the world that we might have a connection with. Just getting to know Esra, but I feel like we have a lot in common, a lot to learn from each other. So to have a filter prevent us from seeing each other is a really powerful thing in contemporary digital culture.
I wonder if people can actively pursue practices that break up that sense of monotony or a single channel being heard all the time by their networks. You know, what kinds of practices can we employ, and how can we confer those practices to our students, etc. And I like Dana's term that she uses, apophoria, which is about the disparate, like making connections where one wouldn't normally see connections. I like that sensibility. And she talks about sometimes how networks themselves should also sort of function that way, that there should be a diversity of the kinds of influences in your own life. But how do we seek those out these days? And, you know, how do we encourage them in our own students? These are questions that I'm not sure how to answer.
Yeah, I mean, I think Ethan Zuckerman's book, Disconnected, does a really good job of describing some of those mechanisms and how we achieve it. In my own life, I'm trying to do it through travel, right? So right now I'm really focusing on the red states, but I've also been trying to make a point of visiting Muslim sites in the US and beyond at a moment that Islamophobia is particularly on the rise. I want to understand firsthand that culture. And there are things I learned from breaking bread together or walking through the city streets and having conversations that I can't achieve simply online, and that's really important to me.
It's kind of like our colleague Chris Gerard. He said one time in either one of these sessions or wrote about it, he says, like, you know, it seems so simple. How much do we spend time with people not like us? You know, and define what not like us mean, but I live in a very red community. And last spring, I went to a Tea Party meeting because I think the sides part gets in our way when we form these assumptions about each other. And in a way, I don't agree with these people, but they're my neighbors. And so there are the commonalities. And so I would agree that that's the approach to take, but it has to be deliberate, because I think when we're in our filter bubble, we don't notice the filter bubble.
And it has to be genuine too.
Yeah.
Because you see the Mark Zuckerberg traveling around saying, "Oh, I need to get to know these red states."
Yeah.
I don't quite trust that.
No.
No.
And you don't get to know people by throwing paper towels at them.
God. It's so painful to watch. It really is so.
It's going to be a beautiful meme, but oh, why do we have to do that?
Oh, yeah.
So this
Yeah.
Sorry, this is Mandy Honeyman. I've been lurking in the background, and I have a question which came up because of what you were both saying. So after Dana's speech this morning, you talked about not being so pessimistic. But I was wondering, your work, is that leading you to feel optimistic?
Yes, but conflicted. Let's put it that way. I mean, like Dana and I have in common a real belief in the power of participatory. We worked together on since for, I don't want to say how many years, because it makes both of us feel old. But she was my graduate student at MIT back in the day, and we've been having this conversation for a long, long time. I've never claimed that participatory culture wasn't without darker elements. That when we open up the doors for participation, people are going to do things that are transgressive, that are resistant, that are awful. Some, and I use the word resistant not simply in a celebratory sense. We often say, it's great to resist, but in fact, they can resist the norms of the culture in ways that are deeply destructive. And reactionary forces can be as resistant as progressive forces. I guess I had been, because I am an eternal optimist, I had the sense that we were going to go through a period of adolescence. I'm not unlike sending a bunch of kids who've been sheltered and to the first week of undergraduate life in the dorms, right? When everyone has to transgress every rule their parents ever laid down. They stay up all night. They use 4-letter words. They smoke cigarettes. They drink. They sleep around. They try drugs. It's like everything's got to be tried in that first week, and then they settle down because your head hurts and your body hurts when you do all of that all at once, and the society develops norms and is capable of responding to it. We are in a more prolonged adolescence than I think I ever pictured of the digital world. And whether it comes with a struggle that Dana's describing, or communities asserting norms for civic and civil behavior that allows people to coexist, I don't know. And so Dana's stuff poses real questions for me that I don't know the answers. I will say that she sees this stuff working on the level of strategy, and I tend to see it as tactics. I don't think it's as thoroughly thought through as Dana often wants to see it. I see people striking out and trying things, and they work. You do more of it. But I don't know that they're as smart and forward thinking about this as sometimes she ascribes to them. So that's where my skepticism of her frame comes. I'm a student of Desserteau, and Desserteau is about how you take tactics and claim any little space or crevice in the society to resist or bring about change. And I see that the tactics are used on all sides right now. And these guys are just trying things, and sometimes they work.
This is where I think we should let Henry get to his next session, because it's about 10 minutes.
Thank you so much for spending a bit of time with us at a very busy time. We really appreciate it.
Well, I'm really looking forward to our tomorrow. And I think there's so much we have to learn your culture and the struggles.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the advice.
Bye, students.
Bye.
You did awesome, Catherine.
Alan, are you going to now? You're running?
Yeah, I kind of want to go to the same session because
yeah, go to Sangeeta's for sure.
Yep. Conversation going, but thanks so much.
Yes.
Thanks
I'll
so
see you
much.
later.
Bye, Alan.
So I'm going to stop the broadcast.